Hi there, Epidemics. Welcome to Thursday. Okay, so the announcements, same ones they were last time. We've got stuff due tomorrow, last week's assignments. There will be new assignments posted either tomorrow or Saturday that will be due the following Friday on April 21st. The project is due on April 30th, so that's getting pretty close. That's just a couple of weeks away. And then the last lecture is May 2nd. Wow, we are really getting close to the end here. So last time we talked, we were talking about antibiotic resistance. And we were talking about how antibiotics had been used in agriculture, and that during the 1950s, it was shown that farm animals given antibiotics would often grow larger and faster than those not given antibiotics. So a lot of farmers were giving their livestock low doses of antibiotics, which is not great as far as, well, I mean, it's a great way to create antibiotic resistance. We don't want antibiotic resistance. We want the antibiotics to keep working. Recent studies have shown that giving antibiotics to farm animals no longer causes them to grow faster. So what happened? What happened between the 1950s and today that changed the effects of antibiotics?
Did it alter their DNA?
Do you mean the antibiotics did or the farmers did?
Like the antibiotics, just like over generations, they eventually just developed the gene to grow larger and faster. I'm just guessing.
Okay, you're really close to one of the correct answers, or one of the, I will say, hypotheses, because we don't know exactly. We just have educated guesses. And one of those is that genetic changes in the livestock have caused them to grow faster, whether or not they're getting those antibiotics. It's not the antibiotics that caused the changes, it's selective breeding by the farmers. They pick the fastest growing and the biggest livestock to breed so that the next generation is going to grow faster and grow bigger.
That makes sense.
We also have seen improvements in hygiene, how clean animals enclosures are being kept in the farm industry. We've seen better disease monitoring, which means that we catch diseases earlier, so they're less likely to completely, cause illness among the whole flock of chickens or the whole barn full of pigs. A disease during childhood, it can have a negative impact on the growth. So by preventing those diseases, it's not that you're increasing the growth rate, but you're removing something that hindered the growth rate. And nutrition has improved. We have a better idea of what to feed our livestock to provide them with all the nutrients they need and produce healthier individuals. Or maybe antibiotics were working on the livestock microbiomes. If this is the case, they would have suppressed the microbiomes that were naturally in the gut, and the microbiomes very likely became antibiotic resistant over time. Microbes, because they reproduce so fast, when they're exposed to low levels of antibiotics, you're going to evolve resistance. Maybe. Like I said, we don't have one complete easy answer because we've changed so many things about the way we manage livestock. We can't pick out one piece and say, this is the reason it's changed. Probably a combination of everything. What else did we used to do that led to increased antibiotic resistance? Well, it used to be that antibiotics were in groceries. Antibiotics would be either injected or painted on meat. You're using antibiotics to prevent the meat from going bad so that you have a longer time period to sell it. It was also put into milk. Some milk had so much penicillin in it that it was basically a therapeutic dose. People drinking that milk were getting a massive dose of penicillin. And lots of vegetables were washed in antibiotics. So here we are getting this constant exposure to antibiotics through our diet. Again, most of this is low levels of antibiotic, which is exactly what promotes antibiotic resistance. Fortunately, this is no longer allowed. They can't do this, at least in the US, anymore. And there was a question last time that was talking about, or was asking me about, is consuming food with antibiotics or from animals who were fed antibiotics, does that cause the bacteria on and in our bodies to become resistant? Absolutely. I even double checked this. Eating meat from animals that have been given antibiotics, the antibiotic is still in the meat. Depending on how you prepare the meat and depending on the specific antibiotic, some of those will break down with the heat of cooking, but not all of them. So yes, you're constant. If you eat meat from an animal that was given an antibiotic, you're getting exposed to that. Which can lead to resistance, which can blah, blah, blah. Yeah, not good. Okay. So we have antibiotic resistance. We have resistance to every antibiotic that we have produced. We have seen resistance in some microbes. We have seen an increase in mortality due to bacterial diseases because of this resistance to antibiotics. It's not nearly as bad as it was before the development of antibiotics, but it is on the rise. Is there hope? There is, and there's a bunch of different things that have the potential to work on this problem. Artificial intelligence or more accurately called machine learning. We can use computers to identify new antibiotics and new targets for antibiotics. People are working on this, trying to develop these. We don't have anything available yet, but there's some possibilities that are kind of coming down the pipeline. We'll have to wait and see if that provides anything useful. There's also what we call probiotic therapy. Now, this is specifically used for people who have antibiotic resistant digestive infections, specifically a disease called C. diff. The diff is a shorthand version of the Latin word. It is C. I can't ever remember how to pronounce it. So it's a longer word than that, and it basically means difficult. So C. diff is a very difficult to treat digestive infection. It shows up in people who are in the hospital, often for some other reason, or it can go around nursing homes. It's really, really challenging to treat. So we can use in patients who have this severe infection that is antibiotic resistant, we can use probiotic therapy. Now, this doesn't mean going to the drugstore and buying probiotics off the shelf. Remember, the number of bacteria in your digestive tract, we have thousands of different species. We don't know what all of them do. We don't know which ones are beneficial and which ones are just kind of like, hey, I'm gonna live in your digestive tract, but I'm not gonna harm you. I'm just gonna hang out here. What people sell over the shelf, they might have 10, 12 different bacteria strains. But again, we don't know if those are important strains or not. So probiotic therapy is a therapy that is going to take samples of digestive tract microbiome from healthy people and put it in people with C. diff. This, instead of treating C. diff with an antibiotic, you're having a microbiome attack it. You're having good bacteria go after the bad bacteria. Pretty cool. Except for how they get the digestive microbiome. Has anybody heard of this before? It's called a fecal transplant. It's exactly what it sounds like. You collect somebody's feces or poop, you want to call it that, and then you make sure there's nothing harmful in there. I mean, you look for some of the major disease bacteria, and then you put it in the digestive tract of somebody who is sick. It can be inserted from either end of the digestive tract, and it works very well. I mean, everybody kind of goes, oh, gross, feces, but it is an easy way to get the bacteria, and it's an easy material to work with to get it into a person's digestive tract. And it works. It works wonderfully. There are also some investigations in looking into doing the same sort of thing in people with things like irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease which are digestive problems, which we don't have a strong handle on the causes of them, but fecal transplants seem to be able to cure people of them. So that's something to watch for in the future. We can do combination therapies. So we have medications that can be given at the same time as antibiotics that can make it harder for certain resistance mechanisms to arise in the bacteria. So if you recall, we talked about how bacteria can have genetic mutations that result in some kind of resistance, changes to the cell wall or the cell membrane, pumps that can actively pump the antibiotic out of the bacteria. Well, we have medications that can make those changes more harmful for the bacteria. So if we're talking about converting a pump so that it can pump antibiotics out of the bacteria, you give them this other medication which either inhibits that pump or makes it difficult for the bacteria to survive while using that pump. This is still very new, and we don't really have a lot of good options for this one yet. We think about stimulating the immune response, right? You can see ads for this. You can see products in the drugstore that say, boost your immune system. Yeah, okay. This one actually is not a good option because an overactive immune system can result in autoimmune disease, which is when your immune system attacks your own cells. It's things like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes. These can be really life-threatening diseases that would last the rest of your life. So let's not stimulate the immune system. Not a good idea. And then there's something called phage therapy. Phage is shorthand for bacteriophage. And a bacteriophage, if you recall, is a virus that infects bacteria. So we can find viruses that specifically target bacteria, cause an infection in the bacteria that then kills the bacteria cells. They are out there, they exist. Finding these bacteriophages can be tricky, but there are some out there that have been found. And there are phage therapies that are available and being actively used in Poland and in the country of Georgia. And probably a few other countries. We're starting to see these become more and more common. Now, this, like I said, it's kind of tricky because there are trillions of different phages. Trillions is such a big word. We really have no concept of how big this number is. So the tricky part, so the good thing is there are lots of options. The bad thing is you have to find the right one. So there is the possibility in the future of genetically modifying phages. Now, a lot of people do not like the idea of genetically modifying anything. Genetically modified organisms scare people. So, this might be possible in the future once people kind of get past the fear of genetically modified organisms a little bit. So we'll have to wait and see. Are there any questions on antibiotics or antibiotic resistance? Because this wraps up that conversation. Okay. In that case, we have a new topic to come and talk about. And it's going to be malaria. So I have a first-person account by Umat Somji. And I'm gonna read this to you. It's a little bit longer than normal, but it gives you an idea of what malaria is like. One day, I was just feeling really lethargic and tired. I had this lower back pain. That was really memorable, the pain in my lower back. And I went to bed, and in the morning, I was confused. I had a fever. I was really sick. My body hurt a lot. So I remember just having like really weird, wacky dreams, and having these high fevers. So my parents took me to the doctors and I got blood tests. Living in the tropics, there's a lot of different things that you could get. Of course, they did the malaria test, but they didn't find malaria. But I had these very cyclical fevers. I would get really, really cold and suddenly I'd be really, really hot again. And I remember when I had the fever, when I was feeling really cold, I would be shivering so much that my muscles would contract so much that they'd be hurting. And I went for another blood test because my mom was suspicious that this actually might be malaria. And still, there was no positive malaria diagnosis. But then my mom took me to the hospital at 2 a.m. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why we were going to the hospital in the middle of the night. And I got the blood test done that time. And they diagnosed me with malaria. And I didn't learn until later that it's really common for malaria not to be in your peripheral bloodstream until the middle of the night. So yeah, that was kind of interesting experience. I feel like malaria was such a big part of life growing up in Kenya. I feel like it was the disease that whenever somebody had a fever or any sort of sickness, you'd always wonder, like, is it malaria? Because it could be, it's really common there. So when you're young, you learn about the Anopheles mosquito. So I remember like in primary school growing up, we learned about Anopheles and what it looked like when it was resting. It has this really unique posture when it's resting, and you can recognize it immediately. And it's something that everybody learns in school from a really young age. When I was really young, you know how, as a stereotype, every kid hates to have the chore of doing their beds. Just like any kids, I hated doing my bed, but there was something else I had to do. I had to fold up and roll up my mosquito net every day, and every night I had to unroll it and tuck it around my bed so I could go to sleep for the night. And I hated doing that. It's a chore, and it's this extra thing you have to do, and I would do it badly sometimes. I remember lots of times my parents waking me up, and I had gone to bed, a rebellious teenager, not putting my mosquito net on. I was the worst, yeah. And I'd be like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So that is our first-hand account of malaria. I've got another quote here, which I think is entertaining. I've modified it into a little more modern language. Man plows the sea like a leviathan. He soars through the air like an eagle. Their voice circles the world in a moment. Her eyes pierce the heaven. They move mountains. He makes the desert to bloom. She has planted her flag on the North Pole and the South. Yet millions of men each year are destroyed because they fail to outwit a mosquito. So when we talk about diseases in this class, the diseases I choose to talk about are based pretty much on severity. I try and get some historical diseases, some modern diseases. I try and make sure we cover bacteria, viruses, and malaria we bring in part because it's a parasite. So that covers most of the pathogens that can cause disease in people. I don't cover fungal diseases because they tend not to be very common or very severe. So they're fungal diseases are not a major cause of morbidity and mortality, sickness and death in humans. So let's look at this in perspective. COVID has killed between 6 and 20 million people worldwide. This is 1 out of every 300 Americans. We keep losing this grasp of how severe this disease is. You know, oh, the pandemic is over. We don't have to wear masks again. The government declares the COVID emergency over. It's not. It's still killing thousands of Americans every week. More than were killed on September 11th, which is still an ongoing emergency and requires us to, take our shoes off and go through all this security at airports and everything. Compare that to HIV. HIV has definitely killed more people than COVID. It's had a longer time to do it in. So AIDS is 36 million, still going on. Plague killed 240 million in several different pandemics. The Black Death itself, remember, that's a 5-year time period, killed between 1/3 and 60% of the population in Europe and the Middle East, around 100 million people. And the population was a lot lower then than it is now. Smallpox, we estimate 500 million deaths. The 1918 flu, about 50 million. Tuberculosis is a big one. We don't have that in our agenda. If we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll talk about it because it's a nasty one and it's not one that people think about. It is still killing huge numbers of people around the world every year. And we estimate that we've had 1 billion people who have died from tuberculosis. Okay, so this sounds like, wow, these are massive diseases. Yes, they are. That's why we're talking about them. Whoop. Malaria, 50 billion. More than tuberculosis, COVID, AIDS, plague, smallpox, the 1918 flu, and tuberculosis. I think I said that one twice, combined. Malaria is definitely the deadliest disease that has ever infected humans. over the lifespan of our species. Now, that's one of the things you have to keep in mind. Malaria has been killing humans since there were humans. So this is a very long time period we're talking about. But even today, malaria kills up to 1 million people a year. So yes, it is one of the biggies. We estimate that malaria has killed more people over the history of our species than any other disease. It is caused by a parasite. So when we talk about parasites, we are talking about organisms that are not viruses, not bacteria, and that live on or inside organisms for, usually when we use this word, we're talking about longer time periods, right? Although we do talk about fleas and ticks as being parasites, and those are animals. Malaria itself is a type of organism called a protist. You may have never heard of a protist before. Protists are larger than bacteria, usually single-celled, and they are more complex than bacteria. They are also more closely related to us than bacteria are. So all of these things, the complexity, the fact that it is more closely related to us, even though it's not an animal, these make it much harder to kill protists. Protists' cellular functions are more like our cellular functions. So we can't just go in and say, we're going to target the cell wall. Yeah, well, it's not different enough from us. Anything we try and target in the protist, there's a good chance that we're going to have side effects from the medication, because the medication is going to go after our cells as well. So malaria, there's several different strains of malaria, or several different species of malaria. And when we talk about these, they're all in this group called Plasmodium. So we usually refer to the different types by their scientific names. Scientific names, the first name in a scientific name will have two names. The first one is a more general term. It's more like your last name. So my last name is Davis. So if I was describing myself in scientific language, I would be Davis Diana. So there are lots of Davises. Davis is a common last name. So they're not all related to me, but all the Davises in my family are related to me. If we were scientifically named, Davis would only refer to people in my immediate family. But anyway, that's a side note. So Plasmodium is the group of organisms all closely related. And we can talk about them as a group as Plasmodium. We can talk about individual species, which would be similar to individual people, by calling them Plasmodium and then their specific name. So there's Plasmodium falciparum. We can also just say P, because we know what we're talking about here. We're talking about Plasmodium. So we can say P. vivax, P. ovale, P. malaria. And when we talk about these, P. falciparum is has a very is recently evolved. Oof. It has a short incubation period, so a short time between infections and symptoms. It is the dominant form in Africa, and it causes the most severe illness. So falciparum is the nasty one. Generally, vivax and ovale can kind of get lumped together because they're very, very similar to each other. These are predominantly found in Asia, and they have a dormant period. This dormant period, the parasite hides in the liver, and this can last for months or years before a person gets symptoms. So if you've been exposed, it can come back. You may not know you have it until literally years later. And the third category is Plasmodium malaria. This is worldwide. It's a milder infection. It also has a longer incubation period. An incubation period of around 30 days. So if you go to Central or South America, most of the malaria there is going to be Plasmodium malaria. There's some falciparum though. So you kind of have to, if you're concerned about malaria, you kind of have to look at which species is dominant in the area you're traveling to. And it can be tricky to figure that out. Most infectious disease doctors who will talk to you about diseases where you're traveling to, they just kind of say, oh yeah, there's malaria there. We're going to give you a preventative treatment, a prophylactic treatment. And they give it to you based on the country, not necessarily specifically where you're going, but we'll talk about preventative treatments a little later. So what causes the different distribution of malaria species? We said some were common in Asia, some are worldwide, some are African. Well, it depends on the availability of a mosquito vector. So malaria not only infects humans, but it infects this mosquito as well. And so different species of Plasmodium infect different species of malaria. I'm sorry, mosquitoes. So if the wrong strain of mosquito is not available, if the strain of mosquito that malaria parasite can infect is not around, you're not going to have that strain of malaria there. Not all mosquitoes can transmit malaria. Malaria also occurs in reptiles, birds, other species of mammals. Avian malaria has gotten to Hawaii, and it's one of the major causes of extinction of Hawaiian native bird species because malaria didn't get there until Europeans did. Nowadays, if you want to find the native Hawaiian species, a lot of times you have to go to high altitudes where the mosquitoes cannot survive. Okay. Malaria evolved a long, long time ago. I've got these slides out of orders. Sorry. We have found malaria parasites in a biting midge. So a midge is not a mosquito. It's a different kind of insect, but it does take a blood meal from some organism. It needs a blood meal, just like mosquitoes need a blood meal, only when it is reproducing. So it needs the protein from blood to produce eggs and to provide enough nutrition for those eggs to mature. This is why only female mosquitoes bite. Only female biting midges bite. The males don't. The males survive largely on nectar from plants. Pretty wild, huh? Okay, so we have found the malaria parasite in a fossilized biting midge from 100 million years ago. This was back during what we call now the age of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs probably got malaria. It's been at least that old. It's a very, very strange parasite. It evolved, oddly enough, from an algae. So we think of algae as a photosynthetic organism, and there are some genes that are involved in photosynthesis that are still in the malaria parasites today. They don't do photosynthesis now. They don't have all the genes, but they have some of them still. Now, algae, we don't think of it as harmful, but it can be. If you think about red tide is caused by a species of algae. Algae sometimes produces chemicals that are toxic to humans or fish or shellfish or all kinds of different organisms. So algae are usually not harmful, but sometimes they can be. And in this case, this algae became one of the deadliest pathogens on the planet. So I'm going to go back to the previous one. Malaria evolved originally, the human's malaria evolved originally in Africa when the first human evolved. So our common ancestor with chimps and gorillas probably had malaria. And as the species split and changed evolutionarily, so did the parasite to stick with us. So when we look specifically at Plasmodium falciparum, it originally evolved right here in the center of Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is based on genetic data. And falciparum, it's, like I said, it's the newest species to evolve. It spread from the DRC, both east and west. And now we have a couple of different subpopulations that we can tell differences between them genetically speaking. Malaria as a whole is much more widespread in Africa than this particular image looks like. I told you that we've estimated that malaria has killed more people than anything else. And in fact, the estimate is that over the lifespan of the human species, Up to half of all humans have died of malaria. Wow, that's insane. We certainly don't have that high of a mortality nowadays, but that tells you that the mortality in the past was probably much, much higher than it is now. If this is right, this is about 54 billion deaths. The current population of the planet, I think that's a couple of years out of date, somewhere around 6 to 8 billion people. To give you perspective, a billion seconds is 31.7 years. If you were handed $1 billion, you could spend $10,000 a day for the next 274 years without taking a day off. It's an insanely big number. Heck, if you had $1 billion, you could end world poverty. Or you could buy Twitter. All right. So, this is complicated here. The malaria parasite life cycle is very, very complicated. So when we talk about life cycles of parasites, parasites often have multiple species they infect. So a lot of times there is a vector and a primary host. I would argue that with malaria, even though we call the mosquito the vector, it's what transmits malaria from person to person. We can also consider this a two-host situation because malaria causes disease in the mosquito too. So, whenever you have a parasite that can infect multiple species that are as different as a mosquito and a human, they have to deal with evading the immune system of both of those species. They have to deal with being able to infect both of those species. And so you tend to have very complicated life cycles. When we talk about malaria, there are several different forms of the parasite. These forms have a different morphology and a different physiology. Okay, these are words you may have heard before, you may not have. Morphology refers to shape. So the physical, in malaria parasites, it's the shape. It can also be things like color, but it's basically appearance based. And so we have different appearances of the parasite in different phases of its life cycle. And physiology refers to basically how the organism functions. So in this case, it's kind of how it lives. If we're talking human physiology, it's how do your heart muscles contract? How do you digest food? All of these sorts of things, how you function. So it's kind of the same thing here with these parasites. I've got these other words written on this slide. You might want to write these down. I'll try and rewrite them on later slides when I talk about these terms. Anopheles, that is the species of mosquito. We'll talk about them forming a cyst. Sporozoites, merozoites are phases of the life cycle. Hemoglobin is in your red blood cells. During a specific phase of the malaria life cycle, they will consume hemoglobin. And a gametocyte is a cell that makes gametes. And gametes are reproductive structures. In humans, that's sperm and eggs. But I thought we would hide most of the picture and talk about it in phases because it's very complicated to look at. Okay, so we start when an Anopheles mosquito takes a blood meal from an infected host. So from a person or from an animal. I mentioned this already. Only females need blood, and they need it to lay eggs. The Anopheles mosquito is the only genus of species of mosquito that can carry malaria. There are around 70 species of Anopheles mosquitoes in the world that are known to carry malaria. Only 30 to 40 species can carry human malaria. So a lot of species, even in this group of Anopheles mosquitoes, a lot of them cannot transmit malaria. And there are an estimated 2,300 species of mosquito worldwide. Not all of them are in the family group or in the genus Anopheles. So they take up the blood meal. And their immune system goes after the parasite. From the beginning, they're going after the parasite. The parasite then reproduces very quickly and in very, very large numbers, so that at least some of the offspring will survive the immune onslaught. During this phase, right after the parasite has gotten into the mosquito, there are male and female parasites. Now, male and female, we're using these terms not so much because they produce the same type of gametes that we do, they don't, or that they have the same genetics that we use to kind of define male and female, or the same kind of genitalia. None of that applies. We use male and female just to denote that there are two different types of parasite at this stage, and that the two types of parasite have to get together with each other in order to produce offspring. So the male and female parasites actually fuse together. So they become one organism, similar to what sperm and egg do, right? Sperm and egg fuse together to form an offspring, or fertilized egg, or zygote. Same kind of concept here, and it forms a single-celled organism. When they do this, and I'm not going to ask you to know most of these terms. So if we went back to the first one, these are the terms that I'm going to ask you to remember: sporozoite and merozoite. So even though these terms are here on this image, we're not going to talk about them, or we're not going to require you to know this. So they form this single-celled organism. This organism then attaches to the wall of the digestive tract of the mosquito and forms something called a cyst. So a cyst is basically a walled off pocket. Hang on. Okay, I apparently didn't get the T when I typed that. So kind of this walled off pocket that helps the organism hide from the immune system. The immune system usually has trouble getting into that cyst. Cysts form for lots of different reasons under lots of different conditions. Most people get cysts over their lifetime that are completely harmless. They come, they go, they usually don't cause any issues. In this case, it is an infection that is being walled off. So now the malaria parasites that have fused together produce offspring. They reproduce. And they do this until the point the cell bursts. Now, the offspring that come out of the cyst have a different morphology and a different physiology than the parasites that the mosquito took up from the bloodstream. Okay, so it's kind of like if you had offspring, but instead of being people, they were pigeons. They look different. They have a different way of living their lives. This cyst bursts and releases the sporozoites. The sporozoites are the infectious stage. And when I say infectious, I mean that it can infect, since we're talking about human specific malaria, that means that they can infect humans. So the sporozoites can travel from the digestive tract of the mosquito. They're released out, they get outside of the digestive tract, travel up to the saliva glands of the mosquito. So the sporozoites are now in the mosquito's saliva glands. When mosquitoes bite, they inject that saliva into your bloodstream. The saliva does two things for the mosquito. It reduces your ability to clot, so the mosquito gets a nice blood meal without having to worry about it clotting in its digestive tract. And it numbs the area so that you don't feel the pain of the bite. So the mosquito is more likely to survive biting you. The sporozoites take advantage of this and travel with the saliva. Now, it has to be the correct species. If the mosquito is carrying human malaria but bites a cow, the cow's not going to get malaria. The wrong host species is a dead end for the parasites. So while the sporozoite is an infectious stage in the malaria, it also has effects on the mosquito. So the sporozoite stage stimulates mosquitoes to be more active, to bite more. And so you've got a parasite manipulating the behavior of the organism it is infecting. It's changing the mosquito's behavior to increase the likelihood that that mosquito will bite the correct species for the parasite to go on for the next phase of its life. It is not the only parasite that can manipulate host behavior. All right. Next up, the sporozoite is now in a human. And now the sporozoite has had to evade the mosquito's immune system, and now it has to evade the human immune system. Human immune system, parasite immune system, very, very, very different. So the parasite has to use different techniques to avoid the immune system. And only the sporozoite phase can cause infections, new infections in people by the bite of a mosquito. So this is, you could take the earlier phase that's forming a cyst in the mosquito, inject it in people, it's not going to survive. It's not going to cause an infection. Only the sporozoite phase. The sporozoites go to the liver. And there they infect liver cells. This is part of their ability to hide from the immune system. So when they're inside the liver cells, they are essentially invisible to the human immune system. I mentioned earlier that the strains Plasmodium vivax and ovale, parasites can hang out in the liver for years. And then later, start reproducing and cause disease. These strains are often called relapsing malarias because you can get malaria, be treated for it, but if it's vivax or ovale, some of the parasite can hide in the liver, not get killed off by the treatments, and come out years later. In the liver, the sporozoites reproduce asexually, which means the cells grow and divide, grow and divide, grow and divide. These cells that are produced in the liver, again, it's not a term we're going to talk about, produces a complex cell. So they infect the liver, they reproduce, form a complex cell. This complex cell takes up a lot of space in the liver cell, and it is able to produce thousands of offspring from each cell. And it's a funny thing because what it's doing is similar to the cyst structure in the mosquitoes. So there's a cell that is producing so many offspring, but they're producing the offspring inside of themselves until they produce so many that they burst and release the offspring. And the offspring released from this stage are the merozoites. It's a different strain or different physiology, different morphology. So we were saying the offspring are so different from the parent. And I was saying it's like a human giving birth to a pigeon. Well, now a pigeon has given birth to a oak tree. Completely different once again. This form is now going to move into the bloodstream. It is going to attach to red blood cells. Oops. And it is going to infect those. Again, by being inside the cell, it can hide from the immune system. So the red blood cells, when they're infected, are not capable. Okay, backing up. You may recall most cells in our body, if they're infected, are capable of communicating that with the immune system. Red blood cells cannot do that. So it's a great place for a disease to hide. There they feed on hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a molecule in the red blood cells that has iron, and it's the molecule that carries oxygen. So it's feeding on hemoglobin, which is reducing the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, which reduces the ability of the blood to carry oxygen. That's going to cause a lot of problems, right? They continue reproducing asexual. And they basically do that until there's no hemoglobin left. Then they burst the red blood cell. And when this happens, there can be hundreds of millions of parasites being released simultaneously. So this is what causes the cyclical nature of malaria, the disease. What do I mean by the cyclical nature? What I mean is if you're infected with malaria in the liver is going to release huge numbers of parasites at once that's going to infect multiple red blood cells. Because of the way this life cycle works, all of those red blood cells that were infected at the same time will release hundreds of millions of parasites at the same time. Those parasites will then infect more red blood cells. Those red blood cells, because they're infected at the same time, will release the parasites at the same time. So every time that you get this massive number of parasites being released, you get symptoms. Your immune response goes through the roof to try to fight off these parasites. And so that's why you can have a time period where you feel sick and then you feel better. And then you feel sick and then you feel better. The immune response is what triggers fevers, chills, aches, and fatigue. This is your immune system functioning. Now, because the parasite infects and destroys red blood cells, you can develop a condition called jaundice. Jaundice, it looks like a yellow color on the skin and on the whites of the eyes. It's caused by an excess of a compound or a molecule called bilirubin. Bilirubin is produced by the breakdown of red blood cells. Usually, I mean, this happens naturally at low levels, and the liver and the kidneys take care of bilirubin and you never even notice it. But when you have so many red blood cells being destroyed simultaneously, the liver and the kidneys cannot manage to remove the bilirubin, and it goes into the skin and produces a yellow color. Most of the parasites that are released are going to be those merozoites that can infect more red blood cells. Sometimes some of the offspring will be gametocytes. These are the forms that can infect mosquitoes and reproduce sexually. It is the only phase that can reproduce sexually. All the other phases reproduce asexually. So when a mosquito takes a blood meal from an infected person, they're going to take up merozoites, which can do nothing in the mosquito. They cannot infect the mosquito. But they'll take up some gametocytes, and those can infect the mosquito and start the process over again. Whew. Man, that's complicated life cycle. This is another way of looking at the life cycle. Here's the phase that can infect the liver. Here's the phase that can infect the red blood cell. Here's the phases that can infect the mosquitoes. So we have the gametocytes, which are released from red blood cells and taken up by mosquitoes. They fuse together, form a structure that attaches to the walls of the mosquito digestive tract, forms that cyst, which then produces the phase that are called the sporozoites that can infect the liver. The sporozoites produce merozoites, which can infect red blood cells. And then there are several different forms here, which can reproduce asexually and produce more merozoites, as well as the reproductive gametocyte phases. Holy guacamole. This is insane. I'm not expecting you to understand this at this point. We're going to go back over it on Tuesday. We're going to go back over this summary part and make sure that everybody's got an understanding of, at the very least, how incredibly complicated this is and some of the basics of how this works. All right, and I talked a little bit over time. Are there any last minute questions before we go? And like I said, we're going to come back to the reproductive cycle and talk about it a little bit more. So if you're looking at it this weekend and you have questions, you can shoot me an email and say, can you talk about this next time? I will be happy to do that.
What do you think the most important thing to keep in mind as far as like the life cycle, like vocabulary, the order of things?
I think the most important thing to remember is that it is complicated because the parasite has to infect 2 different types of organisms and 2 different types of cells in humans. And that in order to do that, it produces these different phases that can do different things. I'm not as concerned with the terminology, or at this point, you know, next week I'll say these terms you need to know, and these are the order of steps and the specific steps I want you to know. But I want you to realize I'm leaving a lot out because it is so incredibly complicated, and you're not biology majors.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, I will see you guys next time. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
You too.
Diana.
You as well. Thank you very much.